So the first thing is I wanted to provide another resource for you to get prepared for the final exam that we have coming up. And the first thing is, again, I just wanted to say how much respect that I have for you, that you are staying in it and you're seeing this thing all the way through to the end. And again, I respect growth. I respect individuals that try to get better, and it's noticeable. I could totally see many individuals that are getting better. So again, I tip my hat. I'm not wearing a hat, but I'm tipping it to you. And I also want to say that I see a lot of really just focused hard work. And it's really cool to see that arc when it comes to growth and really trying to learn material and get better. And hopefully, I'm sure you guys are doing it in your other classes as well. That's not lost on me. I know you're taking other classes, you have a job, children, all kinds of things going on. So I totally understand that. And I appreciate that. So continue to do that and get better being you. So let's go ahead and continue. So the agenda for today is for this review. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go through each section and really just ask, are there any questions? And then I'm going to review it a little bit. I'll talk about it. As I'm reviewing it, that's an opportunity for you to jot down some questions that you might have. So I'm using it as really a priming effect, meaning that me reviewing it, being concise, but yet, a little bit detailed, hopefully will allow you to think about and generate some questions. And then I'll come back at the end of the little section and ask if you have any questions. So I'm going to start right now and really just ask, are there any logistical questions on anything logistically, such as grades, final exam, anything that you have out there? Now is your opportunity to let it rip.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
Yeah, I always like the logistics of like the type of test is kind of what stresses me out. So I really appreciated when we had the essay that you mentioned it way in advance, like, okay, there's going to be an essay, just so like when I'm taking the test, I know it's timed, but at the end I'm like, oh, is there an essay I have to write? So I have to, time management has to go a little bit faster if you have to do something like that. So I guess my only question would be is if there's essays in a final.
100% with you on that, and thank you for that thoughtful question. And we will not have an essay for this final exam. It will be 100% multiple choice. Okay, it will be timed, and it will be similar to the timed quizzes that you have been taking up to this point. And it's not cumulative. And by the way, there's reasons for everything that we do in here. You can always ask me. I just don't cover a lot of things because that would be another, content lecture in and of itself. But there's reasons why we do everything. And so it is timed, and it's a 2-hour time limit. I believe it is 97, 98 questions, somewhere around there. And it's a big one. It's a challenge, and again, it's not lost on me that y'all have other classes. You have a lot of things going on. I totally get it. I don't do these things if I didn't think that you can totally lean into it and be able to effectively execute it. And so that's why I'm doing this, to be able to help you guys better with it. So it's on chapters 10, chapters 11, and chapters 12. Okay. Any other questions?
So far, that's my only question.
Okay. All right. And then if anybody else has any questions about logistics, grades, extra credit, anything, now, not to say you can't ask it later, but now would be a good time to do that. Also, as I'm going through, it's your choice. You have the option of throwing your hand up electronically. You can even just say something like, Professor, I have a question. And then I'll stop and we'll address it from there. You can also use the chat box if you have questions there. So it's totally on you. Whatever you're comfortable with, we'll let it ride. All right. So no questions logistically?
I do have a question. I
Yes.
completed the extra credit that you had given us previous. Mm-hmm. Will there be opportunity for more extra credit at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know at this point. I really don't. I do have some things in the queue that are ready to go. Every class is a little bit different. My whole outlook is that extra credit is for those individuals that are right there, man. They're right there on the edge. They've been getting better as they progress, but yet they're so close, right? They're so close between, 89 point whatever, and they're so close between that next grade. So I'm for that. I just don't like the idea of individuals chasing points as a last ditch effort, to try to, close the loop on a class. I'm more concerned with you guys learning. I really am. I'm more concerned with you learning. So I don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you this. I've already seen some of the data come in from our last quiz. And so I might be doing that. If we do, you will know in the next couple of days. Okay. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay, cool.
And,
Any other questions logistically? All right. So what I'm going to do right now, like I said, the chat box, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop it in there and or raise your hand electronically. I'm going to share my screen and take you to this. Now, can y'all see the study guide right here? Okay, awesome. And then I have a couple screens here, so I just want to double check that you guys are able to see that. So, all right, let's go ahead and continue. So chapter 10, that's today. Today's chapter 10 and chapter 11. And it's just a ton of fun. This is a great subject, great discipline within the discipline of psychology. I am not going to re-lecture all this. This is a review. The assumption is that you've already read, studied, and taken quizzes. You've already looked at this from a critical lens. And then this is for me just to paint with a wide brush on that canvas so that you might have other questions. So let's go ahead and go. The first thing, in fact, before I even start, are there any questions on the 5-factor model? Any questions on that? No. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about it just a bit here, and then maybe you'll have some questions from there. So for the test, we are going to, of course, have some questions on the 5-factor model. When we look at personality, we're looking at how do we assess it and how do we factor in all the characteristics that make us who we are. The 5-factor model is a contemporary approach to describing what personality is, okay, compared to other approaches such as the biological approach, such as the psychodynamic approach, where those approaches really explain the trajectory in terms of how we've come to develop personality. The 5-factor model explains what is going on with us. And so there's 5 key areas. One of them is openness. And then we have conscientiousness, we have extroversion, agreeableness, and then neuroticism, stability. 5 factors, okay? And how you can remember that is the acronym OCEAN or CANOE. Now, at the center of the 5-factor model that I really want you to familiarize yourself with is conscientiousness, which is one of the factors out of the 5. And all 5 factors fall on what's called a dimension. Just like conscientiousness, it's on a dimension. So it's not like a flip switch. Either you have it or you don't. It's a dimmer switch. So conscientiousness is where we are on a continuum of strong tendencies or weak tendencies. Conscientiousness is a cluster of characteristics such as, discipline, organized, clean, for example. On one extreme side, if you score really high, that's the side that you're going to be on, called strong tendencies. If you score really weak, then the characteristics would be that we could observe is undisciplined, maybe lazy, okay, always late, right? Things like that. So the 5-factor model is structured in a way that they all fall on dimensions, okay? And then there's much more to it, but I'm just kind of scratching the surface when it comes to that. So are there any verbal or audible questions before I check the box? I might have to check that box towards the end because I can't even see it right now. Any questions on that? All right. So please get your questions in the chat box if you have them. I will check it once I get down to the end of this chapter. Okay. And then again, you can also raise your hand if you need to, or just, speak out. Traits versus states. Again, you notice how I'm just going through these. This is the review sheet. I kind of cringe at this because, I'm not really building the context of the full lecture. There's much more nuance and context to this instead of just saying, hey, traits and states and 5-factor model. That's where you come in, where hopefully you've already read it. And so you've built some context when it comes to this. Traits, what we're looking at, and then again, this is no any particular order, but traits and states is this. Traits, we're looking at dispositions, dispositional tendencies that are durable. Okay, they're stable over a long period of time. And they're represented in characteristics, and that's where the 5-factor model comes in. So individuals have specific traits that we can see, we can describe them, such as conscientiousness, such as being organized on time. Now, states is really a temporary experience. And so it's really an experience that takes place that's contingent upon the situation. So whereas traits is durable, it's stable, it's like that is who you are, states is and relies on the situation. Here's an example. Traits, we would say, hey, that person's really moody. Compared to states, we would say, hey, that person's being moody because they're on a Zoom because they're trying to study for this big test. And so they're a little moody. That would be considered states. Okay. Any questions on that? Nope. Okay. And I'll just go ahead and continue. And if you have questions, do not be shy. Be you. Throw that hand up. Raise the hand if you have questions. So the trait approach is when we look at the trait overall, or traits, we look at what's considered effective, what works with looking at this approach, and then what are some of the critiques behind it. So what's good is that when we take a test, and let's say we take a test, personality test on a 5-factor model type of structure, what's really good is that it standardizes the language. It makes it clean, it makes it clear and objective, because there is some statistics to it. It's objective. And so we can predict, describe, and explain behavior more efficiently. So that's a good thing. Another good thing is that there's some good correlational research. So we can say that based on research, for example, if you score really high on conscientiousness, the research suggests that there's a directional link with conscientiousness and maybe high performance on the workplace or in the work job, right? So there's a lot of good correlational research. Now, remember, it's not causal. It's not causal. It's not experimental research. It is correlational, but that is one of the good things. Now, the critique or critiques is that the trait approach, such as the 5-factor model, does not take in the situation, doesn't really take the situation into full consideration. We should know by now that the situation is paramount when it comes to behavior. And so the 5-factor model does not factor that in. There's some pun there, pun intended there. So the 5-factor model does not look at the situation. And the next part, that's a critical element of the trait approach in general, is that it doesn't take into consideration the nuance of human nature. So, for example, if we just say, hey, someone scores really high on conscientiousness, that doesn't mean that they're a conscientious person per se, even though the test would indicate that. There's no absolute truths when it comes to human behavior, right? So that's where there's a critique on it, where it's really hard just to label someone as is this, because there's many factors, there's many variables that occur, that co-occur, that confound, and so there's just a lot of nuance. So that's traits, the good and not the bad, but really the critiques. Any questions on that? Okay, let's continue. And again, just to remind you, I'll check that chat box here when I get down towards the end of this chapter. Self-efficacy theory, here we are with Albert Bandura. And when we're getting ready for a test right now, you want to think about this, like how, for example, self-efficacy, in order to know that, you should know, okay, Albert Bandura, right? The person that's linked to that theory. You should also be mindful of the fact that we're talking about social learning theory as it pertains to personality, okay? So you see how that works. If I just post a study guide, there's a lot of nuance that's missed. And that's why it's really good that you come join an actual live fluid talk like this. Self-efficacy is built on the notion that personality, this is Albert Bandura's work right here, that personality is developed through the need and the discovery of self-efficacious behavior, meaning that we're all kind of driven to develop in a way that we feel that we can be successful at things, okay? And with that, there's two parts to his main theory on personality development is one of observation. We learn by observing. That plays into our personality. And then the second part is cognition. I have free will. I can think about things. I can solve problems as it relates to what I see. Now, self-efficacy specifically as it relates to all the things we just talked about is the perception that someone can successfully complete a task, okay? Self-efficacy is not necessarily just overall what we call global confidence. It's more specific. Self-efficacy is about task effectiveness, which is efficaciousness. So it's about having the thought, hey, you know, I think I could be successful at this. It's usually one specific thing, not global confidence, not self-esteem, right? Not self-identity. Those are different constructs. Self-efficacy is really specific on specific tasks. One could be self-efficacious in, like for me, maybe teaching or psychology, but if you put me on a board and you tell me to draw something, dude, I'm gone. I'm horrible at that. So I would be low at self-efficacy when it comes to drawing something. So that's self-efficacy. Any questions on that? All right. Yeah, take a deep breath, stay with it, right? Stay in this thing. The next one here, again, looking at personality development. What is personality? How does it progress? How does it develop? Psychodynamic approach. This is one of the main approaches that we've already talked about. When we look at personality theory, we look at psychodynamic approach, we look at who other than Sigmund Freud. So when you see psychodynamic, you think Sigmund Freud, and then you also think of the unconscious. Okay, so Sigmund Freud theorized that personality is progressed and developed through unconscious urges. Okay, and these unconscious drives are in conflict. There's this incessant conflict between what's called biological urges versus societal demands, and it's the toggling and it's the negotiation between these two problems that allow us to develop our personality. We have deep biological urges that are just yearning to be expressed, but yet on the other side, we also have societal norms, rules, we have law and order, and we understand that as we get older. And then we're trying to figure out how to balance those. And so that's the psychodynamic approach. Now, at the center of that is his stage theory of personality, meaning the different stages of how personality is developed in childhood. And so Sigmund Freud looked at three different areas, very similar to an iceberg, with what's called the id, the ego, and superego. The id is the biological element of personality, okay? And so the id is not concerned with reality. It's concerned with I want right now. It's the pleasure center of what's going on. And so, for example, it's the baby who has who's really tired, who's hungry, who just starts crying, doesn't really care. It could be the 1-year-old who just runs out and starts screaming and yelling because they don't really care about anything else. They're not concerned with really reality, what's going on. They're concerned just with the biological needs. Okay, so that's the id. So they will do whatever they can to satisfy those needs. But as they start to get a little bit older, they start to learn the constraints of reality, and the next part of personality develops, which is called the ego. The ego comes in and is a balancing act between the impulsivity of the id, the I want right now. I'm just going to cry until I get what I want. It's going to balance that with the shame and doubt of the later part of personality development, which is the superego. So the superego comes next. But before I get there, another example of the ego, as we start to develop, the child starts to develop, they start to understand that they can't just cry. They can't just run out and throw something at someone. They understand, there might be consequences for that. And that's the ego starting to develop. Then what happens is the superego starts to develop around 4 or 5 years old. And that's really known as the conscious and our conscious. And so what that is the superego is trying to not allow the ego to take so much so soon, right? So the id wants so much. I want pleasure, I don't really care how I get it. I want it. The superego says, dude, you got to slow down. We need to think about morals, what's right or what's wrong. And if you don't do that, I'm going to provide shame and doubt. So if you can see the tension right here, it's almost like on my shoulders, I have an angel right here and the devil right here. The devil's the id. I want. The angel right here is the superego, says, hey man, slow down. That's too much. And in the middle, the head right here, the thinking part, is saying, look, I need to balance both of these, because if there's too much represented in the id, too much represented in the superego, that's where psychopathology start to rear its head. And so that is the psychodynamic approach in a nutshell. There's much more to it, but we'll cover more of it once we get to his psychosexual stages. Psychodynamic. All right, any questions on that? How we doing out there? Doing okay? All right, take a deep breath. Let's roll. The next one is projective tests with chapter 10. And now for the test, think about, in order for you to know about projective tests, you probably should familiarize yourself with objective tests. Even though it's not on here, it just makes sense, right? So you understand that. For example, the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, that you've read about and read some and had some Connect questions about. That's an objective test. That's a keyed up actual test that has numbers, numeric value, statistically driven, compared to projective tests, which is really subjective. It's all based on the clinician's and the client's interpretation, inferences as to what's going on. So more unconscious right here is projective tests. There's two that you want to be ready for when it comes to the test. One is the Rorschach ink blot test, and the second one is the thematic apperception test. The Rorschach ink blot test is where the psychologist or licensed professional holds up some cards, specifically 10, and the client is basically looking at the cards and asked, what do you see? And so it's basic interpretation, right? It's interpretation of the what. What is going on? What are you seeing? Now we compare that with the thematic apperception test, which is the second projective test. That is where the client is subjected to another card that's put up, but now they're not asked what is on the card. They're asked, what kind of story can you tell me about that? What's going on with this? So that's more of a narrative. It's more of a theme. And so the individuals they're interpreting what's going on. And so is the actual psychologist that's administering the test. And so this is a lot more subjective. The Rorschach test is low on validity, maybe high on face validity. And then the thematic apperception test, that is a little bit higher on reliability. So we tend to pull out a little bit more on that test when it comes to understanding what's going on with personality. All right, now any questions on that projective test? Any questions on that? No? Okay, staying in it now. Defensive mechanisms. Remember how we just talked about the id, the ego, and superego, and the person in the middle right here trying to balance, the angel over here and the devil over here. Well, that's the ego. And so you might have a question right now, how does the ego balance those? It's somewhat of the mitigator in the middle. Well, the ego balances them by way of what's called defensive mechanisms. Defensive mechanisms are tools, strategies that the ego uses to distort reality to reduce anxiety that's caused by the id and the superego. Okay? And so specifically, these are the ones that are going to be on your test. The first one's denial. Denial is where we fail to acknowledge the reality of what's going on. Okay. So for example, we see this, there's so many examples. You get that call at night. And again, this is totally hypothetical. Someone calls and says, someone has died. And you get the news and maybe you're hearing it, but you're not processing it. And you just flat out deny it. No way, that didn't happen, right? And so maybe someone's in a freeze mode. They don't really know what's going on. That could be denial. Another example is Donald Trump right now with the election, again, this is no way political at all, but for example, statistically speaking, looking at numbers, he lost, looking at the raw data coming in, right? So that would be denial. That means they don't even understand. They're just actually unconsciously denying the truth. Here's another example. So that's a Donald Trump example. We go way back with Bill Clinton. He would be a liberal and Trump would be a Republican. Another example both ways, right? We'll pick on both of them, is when Bill Clinton was asked, hey, did you have sexual relations with this lady? And what did he say? He says, no, I did not. So that's denial. And it was really quick. He didn't think about it. It's unconscious. It happens really quick. Now, these people can backpedal later on. We're not talking about that. We're talking about in the moment, unconsciously. Now, repression. Repression is a really, really big one. It is called motivated forgetting. This is when the ego, and the ego is partly conscious. So, hopefully you read about this a little bit, but there's called a pre-conscious. So it's partly conscious. And what happens is, for example, if someone had a traumatic experience as a child sexually, or had, any kind of, they saw something that was traumatic, and it's too traumatic for them to process it and think about it, it hurts too much, then as soon as it comes to awareness, as soon as it comes to the ego and they recognize it and it hurts too much, that's where the ego pushes it back to the id and the unconscious. That's repression. So that pushing down back out of the unconscious is repression, called motivated forgetting. Okay. And we typically see that with trauma. And everything I'm saying here is based on Sigmund Freud's models. Sublimation is where we behave in socially desirable ways. So if I'm a child on the playground and my name's Jimmy, and Johnny is on the playground and takes my truck, instead of punching him in the mouth, I'm going to sign up for maybe flag football or tackle football and not punch him, but maybe I'm going to go tackle someone else. So I sublimate. So my behavior now is basically expressed in more socially, pro-social, desirable ways. Okay. And instead of punching someone, I become a professional boxer where, it's my career, it's entertaining, so it's more pro-social. That would be sublimation. Now, slow me down if you have any questions. I'm not even lecturing right here, by the way, I'm just reviewing. And I would never lecture like this in a course. I would never just bam, 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 go all the way down. But this is just a review that we're doing. Projection. Projection is this. I fear most what in others that I see in myself. Okay. So projection, I like to think of a flashlight. So for example, let's say hypothetically that I was unfaithful to my wife, which I would never do because I have the best wife in the world. She's amazing. I would never do that. Plus that's obviously horrible. But let's say I did that and I cheated on her. And what I do to be able to reduce anxiety based on Freud's model is I project on others. So I'll come home, I was the one who cheated. So I'll look at my wife and I'll say, hey, Jamie, why are you checking your phone so much? Who's calling you, right? So I project on her. I take the flashlight. Instead of looking at myself, I put the flashlight on her. I project on her what I most fear about myself that I see in her, right? So we call it projection. And so if I'm the one that did the cheating, I'm going to look for any behavior that she does that would indicate that. We call it projection. All right. Let me know if you have any questions on that. Reaction formation is when we behave in an opposite way to hide our true feelings. I remember in 4th grade, there were some people chasing me now. Okay. I had a couple girls chasing me and they were hitting me. They were punching me. Okay. So this theory would say, you know what? Maybe they liked me. Maybe they were chasing me down on the playground because they really liked me. But you might say, well, why are they pulling your hair and punching you? Why are they doing that? Well, that's reaction formation. That's the ego distorting reality so that they can balance that tension. Another example would be as an adult, we would see maybe individuals that are homosexual and they come out and join a heterosexual group that's against homosexuals. So they're really extreme, right? And they're the ones that really say, hey, loud, I'm not a homosexual. I don't believe in that, right? When maybe obviously they are, but they're switching. They're operating in a way that doesn't fit really who they are, okay, to be able to resolve those conflicts, okay? So that is defensive mechanisms. We are almost there with chapter 10. Any questions? Any questions? We doing okay out there? All right. Now, let's continue. The psychosexual stages, here's where it gets really entertaining. Freud was something else, right? And Freud had a belief and a thought that life is all about this tension, these sexual urges that are built up, just waiting to be fully expressed. Okay. And if they're not, if these tensions and urges and impulses are not fully expressed, that is when we run into problems. That is when we run into the problems. And what those problems are those problems are called fixations. Okay. And then we'll talk about how those kind of tie in here in just a second. And this is when his psychosexual approach is a stage theory, again, that we have different stages. And the first one being oral. Each one of these stages has a conflict that we need to figure out. The first one is what we call oral. All right. Now, within each of these stages, the oral, anal, phallic, and so forth, there are developmental tasks that we need to sort out. And a big one is something called erogenous zones. Freud believed that there's stimulation and sexual impulses and urges at various parts of the body. Okay, so let me make sense of that. The first one is the oral stage. The oral stage is when the child, really the infant, this is when they're chewing, they're rooting, right? They're sucking on things. And the major development task is those as it relates to feeding. Okay, so it's all about the biological component of feeding. That's the developmental task. If they do not have those needs met at that point, Freud would say fixation is going to take place and energy is locked in that stage. And what we would see is if there's fixation there, those needs weren't met, then individuals would have an oral personality as they get into adulthood. So they would they would talk a lot in aggressive or sexual ways. They would chew, they would bite, they would suck, they would smoke, they would eat a lot. This is Freud's theory, right? That's called an oral personality if there's fixation and it wasn't sorted out. So stimulation takes place around the mouth. The next part here, if they successfully navigate that, they get to the anal stage. And so the erogenous zone here is the anus. And again, this is Sigmund Freud, right? It's pretty interesting little outlook here on his theory, is the area of the anus. And this is where toilet training comes in and what we call potty training at this stage. And that's the main developmental task. If that doesn't go well, if fixation occurs there, meaning that the child feels rushed, they don't feel that they're learning at the appropriate speed of toilet training, then they get fixated and they start to develop an anal personality as they get into adulthood. And so we can see two things that occur in this stage. Later on as adults, we would see, anal retentiveness where they're really tidy, they're organized. That's one side. Or they could come out the other end and maybe there's anal expulsiveness where they're completely messy. They're all over the place, right? And so that's what we would see if there was fixation there. Now, this is why Sigmund Freud has staying power right now, because it does sound bizarre. This is not actually even empirically researched, because we can't actually set up an experiment that could suggest that there's any validity to this at all. But he has staying power because for a lot of us right now, we still use his terms. It still makes sense. We have aha moments with Freud. We start to think, oh, that makes sense, right? So that's why I have so much staying power. Okay, now, if you're still listening, you want to really lock it in right now, because this is a big stage right here, the phallic stage. And there's going to be definitely some questions out of this one. Otherwise, it wouldn't have made this slide right here. But the phallic stage, Freud said, this is a big one compared also to Erik Erikson's model when we talked about the socio-emotional development with trust versus mistrust. Very similar here. This phallic stage sits right there in the middle. It's a big one developmentally. The phallic stage is when the child starts to really be cognizant and aware that they have genitals, and they start to realize that they have anatomy. And anybody here that has kids knows where I'm going with this. How many times have you told your child, hey, get your hands out of your pants? they start to discover, hey, I have, genitalia, and it feels different. When we touch our wrist and we scratch it, it feels different than when we touch a erogenous zone. It's just more sensory, it's more sensitive. And that's when they start to figure this out at the phallic stage. Now, there's two major tasks that take place during this actual stage. There's two main things that come up. One is called the Oedipus complex. The other is called the Electra complex. The Oedipus complex is where the actual girl develops a sexual relationship, emotional sexual relationship, the boy, with the mother. Okay. And that obviously creates some tension. And so the boy is scared to death of the father because the father is the rival. The father's the rival. And the boy is afraid that the father is going to cut his penis off. Okay. Sounds pretty wild, but this is the theory. And the child starts to develop what's called castration anxiety. Okay. So what happens is if they can sort this is the conflict right here, is that the child, the boy that has the Oedipus complex, starts to develop more of a superego. That's that conscious that comes in and says, dude, wait a minute, there's no way you can do that. Society does not, pay or reinforce that at all. So you got to slow down. I'm being totally, basic here, but that's essentially what it is. The superego actually overdevelops, and that leads to problems too. And the boy starts to identify more now with the actual father. And that is the major developmental task. Is called identification. Okay, that's healthy development in the phallic stage. It's to be able to identify with the same sex parent. Now, the girl is what we call goes through the Electra complex, where she sees and notices that boys have that thing called a penis, and I want one. And this is all unconscious, by the way, right? And the girl starts to develop a sexual relationship with her father because she wants a penis. And she's mad at the mom because the mom is who is the person that brought her into the world. And she starts to develop the relationship with the dad. But that is a problem, right? There's more tension there. A little bit of the superego develops with females that kind of tempers that, but more emotions develop more that allows the child, the girl, to start to slow that down and to identify over with her mother. Okay. I know it sounds like a lot, but that's what's going on. So what happens is that, Sigmund Freud theorized that, girls are upset they don't have a penis, and they're inferior. He thought they were inferior to men at that time because they didn't, and they had tension built up, and that's why they develop relationships with their fathers. And again, healthy development is when they recognize this and they shift it, and they do it by way of the superego. They also sublimate, they express themselves. There's something else called transference. And so there's some other things going on right here, but you really need to know the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. And the main developmental task with the phallic stage is identification. If that's not met during the phallic stage, this is where we would see psychosexual disorders. Sexual disorders. We would also see, this is not even in your book, but you would see homosexual behavior. Okay. The DSM in the 70s and 60s actually recognized homosexuality as a disorder. Obviously, we don't do that now. It is not a disorder, and we have changed that. So the DSM is the actual standard manual for psychiatric disorders. It's been changed, but that's where it really started back here with this theory, the phallic stage. Okay, here we go. The latency stage is now where we take pause, about 6 years of age, where the child takes pause with more sexual impulses and is more interested now in intellectual pursuits, communication, social connection. And so there's not really fixation at this stage. For whatever reason, Freud looked at really how the child takes pause with the erogenous zones and goes more intellectual and also social bonding. And that led into the next stage. I had to move this around, called the genital stage. Okay, the last one. And this is where there's like a reawakening, where now the child starts to develop that sexual maturity now. So now the tensions, the impulse, the pressures come back, but they're more mature. This is where the child around adolescence and even goes into adulthood starts to develop stronger emotions, and there's a shifting to the well-being of others. That's a big part of the genital stage, is that all these other stages are more egocentric, and it's all about me sorting out, which we need to do. We need to sort those out. But the genital stage is reaching out and now looking at other people, and we start to see relationships between boys and girls, and of course goes into adulthood. So fundamentally, psychosexually, when it comes to these stages, healthy development is when, this is Freud right here talking, is where the person is not overly fixated in one particular area, but they have, their trajectory has led them through this development when it comes to all these developmental tasks, and they are mentally healthy if they've met those actual conflicts and they've been able to sort those out. All right, any questions there? Then we have chapter 9, okay? Humanistic. No, okay. Humanistic personality is we do what we do because, not just we do what we do, our personality is developed because of we have a desire of having positive, of really emphasizing positive qualities of what we have. So there's motivation in this. We have free will, okay? And then we have growth. Those are all wrapped around the humanistic development of personality. And the big one here that I want you to know is unconditional positive regard and conditions of worth. This is a part of our environment where personality is squarely contingent upon the level that you perceive that you have been loved and you have had regard for. So for your mom, your dad, or your caregiver, unconditional positive regard means that they love you and they respect you. It's really respect you, not for what you do. Conditions of worth is when they place conditions on it. You know, you bring home an A for a test and your parents light up, oh, that's awesome, you got an A. They might perceive that, oh, wait, I need to get an A to be loved, right? Now, I'm not saying that's bad to not do that, but that's a condition of worth. If the child senses that over a long period of time, that they have what's called conditions of worth, that the parents love them for what they do and not who they are, that's when they start to get away from what Carl Rogers called congruence. So they start to develop an incongruent personality, and that can impact their identity. Okay, so that's the humanistic perspective. All right, let's take pause here just for a second. And let me pause this, take a deep breath. Are there any questions over that? I know that's not really a lot, because that's just, I really kind of scratched the surface on some of these. It is here's a good question right here, is that you should have examples. I did list some examples. If you want more, throw your hand up and I will give you more examples. That's an excellent way to learn the material, is to not just read the material, but to really, well, you got to read it first, but then you have to try to answer questions in your head, try to recall it from scratch. And with that, if you can provide examples yourself, absolutely. And the test is written in that way, in that, you know, what are some examples? If you have a good arsenal of examples, you're going to be on track. Okay, you will be on track. All right, let's get back to it. I don't see any other questions. If I do, I will come back to it. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Okay, I don't want you to leave in this thing, you know, saying, hey, I wish you would have done this. Please let me know and I will do it. This is about you. This is about you right now. All right, Stanford prison experiment. Again, I'll be succinct with this because I don't know how deep you want me to go with this. If you want me to go deep on some of these, you know, or light on some of them, you know, let me know, which I have no problem doing. Stanford prison experiment. Now here, social psychology is the social context. As soon as we add one person to the equation, our behavior changes. Stanford prison experiment, at the center of it was Philip Zimbardo, a researcher at Stanford University. And he was curious. He was curious with the prison life and the abuse that took place in the prison. And he was curious as to the effect of human beings that are mentally healthy. Would mentally healthy individuals do evil things if the situation supported it? That was his research question. And so he set up an experiment on prison life. And he built a mock prison in a basement at Stanford. You can actually go there right now, and it's a museum, because this is an infamous and famous experiment. And he set up a mock prison, recruited many individuals through the newspaper, ended up, coming down to a certain number amount, and took these people in, divided them into groups where they were randomly assigned as prisoners or guards, and he was the warden. So there's really, 3 areas. And they basically simulated the whole process. They had the Stanford Police Department in on it, or the, what is it, Los Altos? I can't recall what town they're in, but they had the police department that went to their homes and actually arrested them and booked the individuals, and then the guards were there waiting. And as soon as this study and experiment started, all hell broke loose. And it was really dangerous. It was deplorable. There were people, beating people, spitting on people, urinating. I mean, it was really, really bad. You need to watch the YouTube video. I've lectured about some of this, and I actually told you to go watch, or hopefully not told you, but asked you to go watch a video, because it's really hard to explain it without really seeing it. And so it was hard to understand it without seeing it. And so they did a simulation of prison life, and it got cut short at day 6. Okay, even Philip Zimbardo was really stunned at the level of aggression. What took place? What really happened? Here's what you need to know for the test, is that there are some things that took place, and one of them is how did so many bad things happen? Well, one of them is called social norms and roles. Social norms and roles. What happened was that when individuals, normal, mentally healthy individuals, and they were screened, got into a situation, they internalized their roles based on their expectation of that role. So as soon as they put the glasses on and they had a baton, they had an expectation to be overly aggressive. And same thing with the prisoners. The prisoners were really submissive, and they would also be combative and yell at times. But what happened was, here's the main conclusions, was that the subjects over internalized their roles. And we all do this. We all do this every day. I worked in the state prison myself in Vacaville, and I have many stories about this. And people do that. They over index on their social roles. And so there's also schemas. Remember that from Piaget? The schemas, we have a mental framework about how we think we should act in situations, or as in a role. We have mental scripts. So that played a role. Okay. So even Philip Zimbardo, he was the researcher that conducted it. He even fell victim to over indexing on his role of being, really consistent with it, instead of pulling it back too soon, which he probably should have. And so the second part is the first part was social roles and really social norms. The next part is flat out is the power of the situation. Is that when we're in a situation that supports a certain behavior, even if we're mentally healthy and we're nice and we think we would not do evil things, research runs contrary to that, is that we would most likely do evil things. And that's the main conclusion that's drawn from that. Okay. Now, these 3 right here, de-individuation, social facilitation, social loafing, what we're looking at here is how the group influences the individual. De-individuation is when we saw the Portland, Oregon riots up north, right? And you're in a big group, and all of a sudden someone picks up a rock or a brick and throws it through a business and busts a window, or they start beating someone up. Why is it that person does that? Well, that is de-individuation. This is where the individual does what they do because there's a reduction in identity. Okay, so if you're in a group, you have a reduced sense of personal identity. You're a part of a greater group. That's the first part. The second part is there's a diffusion of a responsibility, is that you sense that if I throw a brick through the window, but there's hundreds of other people doing crazy things, that I'm not responsible for it. That's how we sort this out in a group. And then the next part is really, we look at not just the responsibility. We don't just look at the identification or identity, but we also look at anonymity. So anonymous, that's a big part of it too. I'm kind of held up in this big group, so I'm anonymous, so I can do whatever. So that's the individuation. We see this on social media. We see this with like the KKK or Halloween. Someone puts a mask on and you're in a group, they act differently. And that's because of all the reasons that we just talked about. Social facilitation, this is where you have learned a skill and you've learned it well. And if you're in the presence of others, then your skill could go up because your arousal goes up. That's the general theory here. And these have been replicated over a long period of time. Social facilitation theory looks at you're more likely to do a better job with performing on tasks that you know well if it's in front of people, because it raises your arousal level compared to doing it just by yourself. Okay. Social loafing is when we reduce our effort if we're in a group setting. Okay. And y'all know where I'm going with this. If you have a group assignment, and we don't have those too much in this class, but if we were to have a group assignment, you know, if you're out there, there's that one person that kind of sits back and might not do anything in the group project. That's social loafing. And what's going on is that there's a reduction in effort because a lack of accountability, because they kind of get hidden in the group. And so accountability goes down. All right, cruising here. Bystander effect. This comes out of the tragic case of Kitty Genovese, and the bystander effect is the tendency for us to help less in an emergency situation when there's more people around. So we're going to help less when there's more people around and there's a highly charged situation, emergency situation. Why is that? Well, the research looks at, again, it goes back to diffusion of responsibility, but it's a little bit different here. With the bystander effect, it's not just blind apathy, but rather it's someone else will do it. It's not my responsibility, but I know someone would call the police if something bad happens. But the problem is most people don't, because they pass the buck. And that's the bystander effect. Okay. Now, how do we explain behavior in groups? This is called attribution. This is how we explain behavior. There's two ways, well, there's actually three ways, but your test is going to cover this. Internal and external attribution theory looks at when someone is moody. Why are they moody, especially when you're around people? Is that person just a moody person, or is it because they're in a situation where they don't want to be in? And so internal attributions looks at dispositions and traits, which means the person's moody. There's an example. The person's moody. If we have external attributions, we would say that the person's moody because of fill in the blank, because of the situation. Again, go back to personality theory. We looked at traits versus states. Very similar alignment here. Traits versus states can connect and thread with this right here. Internal, we would say traits. We over-index on traits. External causes of behavior, we would say it's caused because of the situation. All right. That runs us into problems, though, because we take shortcuts and we have what's called fundamental attribution errors, where we overemphasize the person's traits, their dispositions, their characteristics, who they are, and we underestimate the power of the situation. For example, someone cut you off on the freeway. They almost hit you, and you're mad, right? And so you start to lock up and you start to say, you know what? You're a punk. And you start to, in your head, or you tell someone that person's a mean person. Most of the time, we go there. We say that. Fundamental attribution error, because we overestimate the power of the traits. So we think that that person's just a bad person. But what happens if they're really in a rush because they're late to work, or they have their wife in the passenger seat and she's pregnant, so they're rushing, right? So that's the situation. So we really jump the gun on things and we over-index on the person. That's what that means. Let me pause just for a second. Are there any questions verbally here before I check the box? No? Okay, awesome. Stay in it now. You guys doing well? I think you're still here, but I don't really know because I can't see. Anyways, let's stay in this thing. The next one here is cognitive dissonance theory. Basically what this is conflicting thoughts, flat out. It's when we have conflicting thoughts. And cognitive is, thoughts, images, sensations, emotions. And then dissonance is tension, it's disharmony. So cognitive dissonance is a result of behaving in a way that goes opposite of your beliefs or your thoughts or global assumptions overall. For example, if I believe that fitness and health is really important, but I smoke and I don't exercise, I don't sleep well, I just do unhealthy things all the time, that's going to lead to cognitive dissonance. Okay? Conflicting thoughts. And so as humans, we want cognizance. Cognizance is where it's the opposite of cognitive dissonance. Cognizance is where we have harmony. So how do we get that harmony? Based on this theory, we either change our attitude that fits the behavior, or we change our behavior that fits the attitude. So if I'm a smoker and I want to get the cognizance, I want to try to get rid of the tension, I'm going to change the way I think about smoking. Well, my uncle, he lived to where he's 90. I'll be okay. I'll continue to smoke. That could be one way. Or the second way is I'm going to stop smoking. So that's how we go about resolving that conflict. The next one is conformity. Conformity is really, to get right to it, is where we change our behavior that coincides with the group standard. Okay. And at the center of conformity is Solomon Asch's experiment, okay, on conformity. And he was curious about how the peer pressure of a lot of people can impact the attitude and conformity of the one person. Let me give an example. Let's say that you come into a classroom and there's 6 of us. Let's say there's 5 people that I asked to come in, and then you're the 6th person. And that you're at a table and there's 5 people in front of you and you're the last person. And I ask the 5 people in front of you that go before you, I ask them to identify the actual line. So this is the experiment right here. There's 2 cards. I have one card right here with a vertical line right here. I have another card I'm holding up on this hand, in this hand, with 3 vertical lines. This vertical line is the standard line, and these 3 lines are different lengths called the comparison line. If I were to say, start with person number 1, remember, you're person number 6. I ask person number 1, hey, this is line A. Which of this line matches one of 3 of these lines? And then you would have an A, B, and C on this comparison line note card, right? And it's real simple. It's better to see this in video where you actually see what I'm talking about, but it's pretty simple experiment. The person 1, person 2, 3, they go along and they say, okay, A matches B, A matches B. And that's really the correct answer. But what happens if 10 minutes into it, they start to shift it where they intentionally get the answer wrong, and you could totally see it. You can see the line A is way shorter than the actual answer that they're given. So they're given an incorrect answer. What happens to you? Would you change your answer if you knew it was incorrect, but would you change it to go along with those other 5 people? Well, that right there, what I just explained, is the Solomon Asch experiment, standard comparison lines. And so fundamentally, most people succumb, or we would say they conform, they change their behavior because of social pressure from the majority of the group, right? Most of us would say, no, I would not do that, but we do. Research suggests that a high percentage of us do that. Now, how does that work? There's 2 parts. One of them is informational social influence. That is when you're the last person. Like I said, there's 5 that go before you, and you sense that they're pretty competent, but you might be in doubt of something. Like, I totally see, it looks like it's the correct answer is A, but they're going with C. It's got to be A, but you'll go with C. You'll change your answer and you'll get it wrong because of the pressure of that group. And the reason is because you're in doubt and you want to get it right. So you have a thought, I might be missing something. And that's what informational social influence is that those people are competent, but yet they're getting it wrong. You'll change your mind because you want to make sure that you're right, but there's doubt, there's tension, and you're not 100% sure. The next reason why we do that is called normative social influence. And the reason for that is because of just raw peer pressure. It's being accepted. Okay. We don't want to be, we call it the black sheep. We don't want to be the outlier. So we do what we do because of the pressure, just flat out. We want to get along and we want to be accepted. Okay. All right. Hey, the last one is the Stanley Milgram's experiment. And you should know, like when you look at Solomon Asch, you should think of conformity. When you look at Stanley Milgrams, you should think obedience. Okay. When we look at Stanford Prison Experiment, you should think of obedience. Okay. The Stanley Milgrams experiment is all about obedience, where now we're going to conform. We're going to listen, not conform. We're going to listen to an authority figure. Obedience is when we listen to an authority figure. Now, Stanley Milgrams created an experiment based on his question: would ordinary healthy people do bad things if an authority figure asked them to do something bad? Would they obey out of what he called blind obedience? Would they just listen to him because he was an authority figure? And the research suggests yes, we will do that. And so again, Google this Stanley Milgrams experiment to get right to it. It was an experiment with 3 people, a learner, an administrator, and a teacher. And the teacher was really the person we're looking at here. The rest of the individuals, the other 2 were Confederates, okay? Meaning that they're manipulating the actual, what they're doing. So they're in on it. And so there's a teacher, there's a learner, there's an administrator. The administrator is telling the teacher again is not in on anything, right? We're trying to measure that person. The administrator says, you need to give this person a shock every time they get a question wrong. So they're taking an exam, they're answering questions. As soon as they get it wrong, they're going to be subjected to an electric volt shock, okay? And that makes sense, okay? Negative reinforcement at the time. Stanley Milgrams was really curious after World War II and the Holocaust. How was it that Adolf Hitler got millions of people to follow along? Well, it was obedience. But Stanley Milgrams was concerned with blind obedience. Is it just because it's an authority figure, they wear a badge or whatever it might be? And it is. And so what happens is that the teacher is the person that we're looking at to see how far will they go. Will they shock that person? That's the learner. And based on the research, most people went the whole way. And so progressively, they would have 50 volt shocks all the way to 75, all the way to 450. That's almost death. But 75 or 70 to 73% of the people went all the way, right? So the administrator would say, hey, please continue, shock him if he gets it wrong. And the teacher would say, wait a minute, this is hurting him right here. It's hurting him. And they were becoming really upset. And very calmly, the administrator in the white coat just says, please continue. Please continue, do your job. And so fundamentally, there's a couple things going on here, is that we are suckers for authority figures. We are highly suggestive. If someone who is a police officer or a politician or anybody in a leadership role that has a title, based on the research, what happens is we're highly suggestive. Not only will we listen to them, but in many situations, if the situation supports it, we'll do bad things. And what's happening is because, again, there's many things that take place as to why we do that, but it's the power of the group. But it's really comes back to a diffusion of responsibility and blind obedience. Okay. So we say, hey, I'm going to put my responsibility on the authority figure. And that's what happened in Adolf Hitler's situation, where it was this mental thought in a group that, you know what, he's the one really calling the shots. I'll do bad things. It goes back to him, not me. Could be the novelty of the situation. It could be the speed of processing. You know, we don't have a lot of time to make that decision. So there's many factors, but fundamentally you should know that for the test is that the power of the situation and blind obedience. People end up doing things because we're highly suggestive when it comes to authority figures. Okay. All right. That is chapter 11. Let me go back here. And that was a review for those areas. Let me go back to full screen. So right on. Thank you very much for that. And let me see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions. And like I said, I mean, I'm here for you. I can go deeper in an area. I could, any questions? Are there any questions on any of that? I'll just open it up right now. Any questions? No? Okay. To wrap this up, the last thing is on Monday, we will have a much shorter review. But like I said, again, if you join and you have questions and you want to riff on, some details, I'm here for you. I'm here for you to try to figure this out. The next live session is Monday on clinical psychology. I'm going to just tell you right now that it's a good idea that you came to this one. It's even more important that individuals come to that one because that's a big part of your test. More percentage of points and questions come from the clinical side of psychological disorders, the chapter 12. And so, really work that chapter and come with any questions that you have, because that's going to represent a large number of the tests. And I want to make sure that I can provide any insight that I can for you when it comes to that. The last thing that I will say is that whether you're on this call or you're not, either way, again, I respect and appreciate your hard work. I mean, for real, you guys are really working hard and you're trying to get better. And I know you're taking many other classes. And again, I respect that so much. And I will say this now, hey, stay in this thing, right? Hey, finish strong with all your classes. Now's the time to put the pedal down. Most people by nature, they tend to pull off the gas at the end. And I get it because we're tired. We get tired when we can see the finish line. We get a little tired. But I want to challenge you, because I know you can respond to it, is that I want you to put that gas down and I want you to finish and go past the finish line. Don't run to the finish line. Go past it. You got this. I'm rooting for you. You totally can. Reach out to me if you have any questions, and I will be more than happy to help you. I will tell you this. Out of 17 or 18 years as an educator, my observation is this, is that a lot of the problems I see in education with some of the students is that they just, not that they weren't, they didn't have the skills to pass a course or to get really good grades or to graduate, get their bachelor's, master's, Ph.D. It wasn't that they had the skill. It was they tapped out too soon. Okay. So the students that stay in it, like you, that stay in it to the very end, will benefit. Most of the time, you will benefit. You'll pass those classes now. If you just stay in things longer and long enough, you'll start graduating. You'll get those jobs. You'll do things that you want based on aligning with who you are. And so again, I want to just urge you to be you, because you're doing it right now, to continue to stay in this thing and to also get better as you're going along with it. So that's really all I have. Again, so much respect to you, and just to finish strong. And then we will be back Monday. That will be half this time. It'll probably be around 30 minutes, clinical psychology. But like I said, I'll go as long and as deep as you want, answer any questions that you might have. Okay. Any questions? Any logistical questions, content as we end this? Are we good?
I do have a question. I was wondering what percentage our final is of our grade.
It's love the question, and it's in the syllabus. Your exams are 50%, if I can recall that. Again, it's already built in. It's already built into the system, but they're worth 50%. So your final is worth 150 points. Okay. And why is that? Well, because if you look at the totality of all the points, we had assignments, we had COVID-19 videos, discussion questions, we had practice quizzes. We had a certain amount of points with those. And then to represent the 50% equates to those points. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so basically you can just go back to the syllabus and look at that. And there's a reason for that, guys. Like the research is really clean on best practices on really how to ascertain information. And one of them is recall. It's testing as many times as we can. And I'm not going to just throw you out in the deep end. I want to provide you with practice quizzes, reading connect questions, very simple questions that just build vocabulary. Okay. Then we start to get to more advanced questions that are more applied questions. Then we get to time quizzes that are more conceptual questions. Then we get to tests where I'm assessing your critical thinking skills. You're applying what you learned to solve problems, right? So I'm not giving you like answers to quiz questions. That's not really science. Remember chapter 1 with empirical research? They're going to do a vaccine right now. You know what they're looking at? They're looking at the efficacy. They're looking at the research. How can we really draw sound research? We randomly assign. And that's what I do. So I randomly pick particular, not random questions, but it's a random sample for you because you don't know what questions, but I did steer you in that specific area with the review sheet so that you get a question. Now you can apply your skills like a job interview. That's why they don't just give questions like, I want you to learn the material, but I'm more concerned with what you can do, not just memorizing things, because you've already had a chance to do that with all the preceding quizzes, connect questions and all those, so that you build the skill for the test where you can critically think and really pull apart, the difference between, that theory and this theory. So there's a reason for it. Okay. And again, I try to provide you with so many different resources and extra credit. And then myself, I'm trying to get better with teaching. And so you and I are working together. I'm trying to get better. I certainly hope you are as well. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions logistically? Nope. Okay, guys. Hey, right on. Nice job. I appreciate you. And I will see you for a very important live session on Monday. Take care now. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys.